Go ahead and start.
Yep. We're going to go ahead and get started. I want everybody to give a warm welcome to Caleb Gates. He's with Catholic Charities. He is going to talk to us a little bit about what it means to be a refugee or an immigrant, sort of the process they go through, and some of what the church can do to help the people that are coming into the U.S. that way. So everybody clap. Welcome. So thank you. I'll let you take it from here.
Okay. Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you for the invitation to be here. Can everyone see this okay? Okay. Hopefully. I wanted to talk to you about, so my name is Caleb Gates. I work for Catholic Charities as a case manager with refugees. So I really enjoy what I do. I find it's a very rewarding work. So I want all of you to start off with, I'm going to tell you a story. I want you all to close your eyes. I'm not going to do anything scary, but I want you to picture this in your mind. So imagine that you were born and you lived your entire life in a village in Africa, and the current government is hostile towards those in your tribe. During a normal family outing to the center of your village, an airplane swoops low over the rooftops. The tremendous noise startles and frightens you. A few seconds later, a whole formation of airplanes appears in the distance and attacks the town. A number of bombs explode and throw debris everywhere. Heavy smoke fills the street where your family happens to be. People are screaming, running in every direction. Your family gets separated. It's impossible to see through the dense smoke that's stinging your throat and lungs. You start yelling too, hoping to find your family so that you can all get away together. After finding some of your family members, your family leaves home without knowing which direction to go. Your sister was injured in the attack and is now handicapped. You cannot find your brother, and you don't know if he was killed in the attack or escaped. You're exhausted by this dramatic journey and everything you have gone through. You spend the night in a temporary shelter with many other families. It's not at all restful. Some members of your family are injured, tired, or even completely exhausted, demoralized, pessimistic, and anxious to know what is going to happen to them. Still, it is impossible to go back, so you flee your country. After overcoming many difficulties, you finally reach the border. You're exhausted, sick, hungry, and thirsty. You really don't expect much except perhaps some water, some food, and a place to settle down for a while so that you can care for the sick and sleep without fear. Unfortunately, you have lost your identity papers during your ordeal, and the authorities in this country are afraid that criminals, agitators, and other troublesome people might try to enter the country. So before doing anything else, including attending to your most basic needs, you're required to fill out identification forms. If you are not able to fill out these forms, you might be sent back without receiving any help. You manage to cross the border, but only after surrendering all items of value that you manage to carry with you to the border guards so that they will let you pass. After weeks of wandering, you arrive at a refugee camp. You will stay here for several years, maybe even decades, waiting for your refugee case to be approved. You marry in the camp and have children. Your children grow up and begin families of their own. Still you wait in the refugee camp. So you all go ahead and open your eyes. So this is just a likely scenario, one possible scenario for what refugees go through. And in this case, and this is made up, but it speaks to what a lot of refugees go through. The most likely outcome in a situation like this is they would either resettle in that country they fled to, or eventually have to go back to their country of origin. Only about 1% of refugees are resettled in a country like the United States or maybe like Western Europe. And so people that are actually refugees who come here are very much the minority. So I want to talk to you first of all, who is a refugee? In 1951, there was a United Nations convention that defined a refugee as a person who, owing to well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group or political opinion, is outside the country of his nationality and is unable to, or owing to such fears, unwilling to avail himself of the protection of that country, or who, not having a nationality and being outside the country of his former habitual residence, as a result of such events, is unable to, or owing to such fear, is unwilling to return to it. Did you get that? That's very complicated. It's like, what is that talking about? Well, that language is very specific for a reason, but in simple language, what it means is that you are a refugee if you are forced to flee your country because of who you are or what you believe. So I don't expect you to remember that complicated definition, but that's what I do want you to remember. In order to be considered a refugee, you have to have fled your country because of who you are or what you believe. So the United Nations estimates, so at the end of 2016, there were somewhere close to 66 million people worldwide that have been displaced because of persecution, conflicts, etc., violence. Of that number, only about a third, about 22.5 million people have been designated as refugees. That number is hard to grasp, but to put in perspective, they estimate about 28,000 people are being displaced every single day. And that would be like if you take the entire population of the state of Iowa is displaced every 4 months. So that's the numbers that we're talking about here. Now you may wonder, okay, you have about 66 million people being displaced that are currently displaced. Why are only about a third of those designated as refugees? Well, the reason is because, first of all, to qualify as a refugee, you have to be outside of your country of origin. So if you fled your country, but are still within that same country, or if you fled your home, and are still within that your country, you're not considered a refugee. You're what's called an IDP, an internally displaced person. So you would not qualify for refugee status. If you were displaced by war, but you were not targeted because of who you are, let's say your ethnicity or what you believe, you also would not qualify as a refugee. If you fled because of a natural disaster or poverty, that does not count. That does not qualify you as a refugee either. Now, I will say that natural disasters and conflicts over resources, those often create conflicts that will result in refugees being created. But that in and of itself is not enough to qualify someone as a refugee. Also among this number of 65 million, you have people who have sought asylum in countries, other countries. The difference there is if you're an asylee, you're already in the country, a different country, and you're requesting protection from that country. So for example, let's say someone who came to the United States to study or maybe to visit family, and let's say there's a coup in their country, the government collapses or there's a civil war and they're afraid to return home, they might apply for asylum in this country. In contrast, a refugee, they're still outside of, in this case, the United States. Now, an immigrant, people talk about immigrants. An immigrant is someone who moves to another place for any reason whatsoever. So that means that immigrants are the broad category. Refugees would only be a small subset of that. So everyone who is a refugee is an immigrant, but not everyone who's an immigrant is a refugee. Normally, someone has to register with, that's the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. They're the ones that refer, that process people. They're the ones that set up most of the refugee camps. And they refer people to other countries as refugees, including the United States. Now, you'll notice on this, it says that in 2016, the total number of refugees that were resettled, down at the bottom, is about 190,000. Of that number, we took in more than half of that. The United States alone took in more than half of that. So we resettled more refugees than any other country in the world. But still, that's a very small number compared to the total number of refugees there are. So what about the refugees that are coming to the United States? I won't show this video, I don't have internet access, but to qualify as a refugee, again, you have to be outside of your country of origin. You have to be referred to the United States by the UN. And you have to pass an extensive screening process. Those who have been admitted to the United States will be admitted with status as a refugee. So here I'm using the term refugee as a legal status. If you enter the United States as a refugee, you have the right to live and to work here in the United States. So you are here legally. You are required after you've been here for 1 year to change your status to become a legal permanent resident to get your green card. And after you've been here for 5 years, you can apply to become a citizen. Now, there's a lot of questions that people have maybe about what is this refugee screening process. It's very, very thorough. So I actually printed off this. This is a flow chart that shows the process that refugees have to go through in order to enter the United States as refugees. It's literally the hardest way to get into this country. If you were going to get into the country, you would not want to go into the country as a refugee. It'd be very, very difficult. It takes a long time, several years for security screenings. And people are concerned about that, but I tell people, it's very, very hard. It's very, very difficult. They're very, very thorough in just vetting people.
What is the difference between an asylum seeker and a refugee? I missed that.
Yes, so asylum seeker is someone who's already, let's say someone is already here in the United States.
Legally.
Well, yeah, they've entered legally, although some people could be undocumented and then apply for asylum, but a lot of times they are here, came here legally on some type of visa. Could have been to visit family, could have been to work, to study, for different reasons. And then something might have changed in their country, and they feel it's not safe for them to go back, so they apply for asylum. Whereas a refugee, you're not in the country yet. You have to be granted status as a refugee, and you're granted that status before you enter the country. If you are more interested and you want to see all the details about what's involved in the screening process, I did write an article for the Gazette the end of February of this year, so you could look that up and you can see just all the process, all the steps that the people go through for that. By the way, so I tell people this, so since the Refugee Act of 1980, that's when really the refugee admission process started, no Americans have been killed in a terrorist attack committed by refugees. There was a study that was put out last year by the Cato Institute. They estimated that the likelihood of someone being killed by a terrorist who's a refugee is about 1 in 3.6 billion per year. To put that in perspective, that means you're about 1,900 times more likely to die in a car accident caused by a deer than you are to die at the hands of a refugee. So the process is very thorough, and actually after 9/11, the security process became even more intense, as you could imagine. So if people, talk about, we need to vet these refugees, we need extreme vetting, it's already very extreme and very onerous in my opinion. So that's who refugees are, and I want to talk to you, first ask you this question: why should we help refugees?
Because they need our help.
That's true, but there's a lot of people that need our help.
Mm-hmm.
So why specifically should we help refugees?
Because if we don't, they die. They get sent back.
Yeah, well, yes, but again, that's also true of a lot of people.
We have a hand in creating them.
Well, that's true sometimes too. Yeah, there's geopolitical things going on that our government might have been had a hand in those. But so in another context, I might talk about the various humanitarian and moral obligations that we have, reasons why we should help refugees. But in this context, I do want to ask you, what is the church's responsibility as the people of God to help refugees?
Oh, it's in the Bible.
Well, I'm going to get there. So there are several places in Scripture that talk about helping the stranger and the alien. And I'm not going to read through all these because there's a lot of them, but I'll read the first one, Leviticus 19:33-34. When an alien resides with you in your land, you shall not oppress the alien. The alien who resides with you shall be to you as the citizen among you. You shall love the alien as yourself, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. So that's Leviticus 19. There's Deuteronomy 10, Jeremiah 7, Zechariah 7. So you have the law, you have the prophets, you have the New Testament in Matthew 25, Hebrews 13. So you have all these verses that talk about helping the stranger. And actually, in some of these verses, judgment is called down because people oppressed the foreigner or the alien. So there are all these verses, but of course, just because you see all these verses about helping the stranger, there's not a one-to-one correlation to a certain nation, let's say the United States, taking in a certain number of refugees every year. And we can't say that because God commanded people to welcome the strangers, that therefore the United States should have an open border policy, for example. So I do want to talk really quick about what are some reasons, specifically some theological reasons for why we should help refugees. First reason is refugees are God's image. By this, I want you to think about Genesis 1, first chapter of Genesis. And in that passage, it talks about God creating the world, and it presents it as God forming the cosmic temple, really the world as a cosmic temple. And what's interesting about this is in the ancient Near East, you have these various hymns and poems that talk about creating temples or building temples. Many of them have a 7-day literary structure similar to what we see in Genesis 1. In those hymns and poems, what you have is the climax is really an image of the deity being installed in that temple. We have something similar going on in Genesis 1, except the difference is the image is not like a statue, it's humanity itself. So in Genesis 1:26, it talks about, God says, let us make man in our image, in our likeness. Another way to translate that is, let us create man as our image, or as our likeness. So the idea is that humanity itself is the image of God. And that's everybody, including refugees. And it's not that we're different, it's not that there's something inherently different or special about us, it's that God has chosen humanity for this special purpose. God has chosen humanity as his representative on earth. And what this means is that how we treat other humans reveals what we think about God. And I think this is the reason why you have in Genesis 9:6, it argues for the death penalty for someone who murders another person, because really what you're saying is, you're trying to murder God by murdering another person. I think that's the reason why in James 3 it essentially equates cursing humans with cursing God, because we were made in the image of God. And then I think about in 1 John it says, you can't say you love God and yet hate your brother. So how we think about how we treat other humans, including refugees, shows how we think about God. So this is why I say refugees are God's image. I'll say second, refugees reveal our true colors. By that I mean they reveal our true beliefs, our true thoughts about other people. That's true not just for refugees, I would say for other marginalized groups as well. Why do you think there's all these passages in Scripture that talk about welcoming the stranger? Does anyone have any ideas? Why? Do you see we looked at saw all these verses. Anyone have any ideas about why all those verses are there? Why is it made such a big deal in Scripture?
The Jews were strangers in their, when they had to leave Israel, so that was part of it.
Yeah, that was part of their experience. So, if anyone, they should empathize with people in those circumstances. Anyone else?
There was a lot of political and social upheaval at that time, so a lot of people were displaced. So there were people wandering every which way, and it was important to take care of everybody.
Yeah, that's happening today too. I will say, I was thinking about this. Maybe one of the reasons why this is talked about so many times in Scripture, there's so many verses about it, is because our true feelings towards other human beings is revealed when we interact with those, or how we treat those that cannot repay us or help us in any way. So I think about, in ancient Israel, you have the widows, the orphans, the strangers. These are people, they don't have any power, They don't have a way to provide for themselves. They were marginalized within that society. They didn't have a central government that has this social safety net that can provide for these people that don't have any connections within that society. And so if you were in that position in that society, if you were a stranger, if you were an orphan, if you were a widow, you were cut off from any sort of provision or protection. And I say again, how we treat those who cannot benefit us shows who we truly are. I think about, politicians, I'm sure they would be happy to help refugees if doing so would ensure them, would make them more popular. Say, oh, I'll be more likely to be reelected if I help refugees. Or let's say a business owner, I'm sure they would be happy to help refugees if doing so would increase their bottom line. But the question for us is, are we willing, am I willing to help refugees when there's nothing in it for me? Or what if helping the poor, the marginalized, the oppressed, and refugees are kind of 3 for 3 on that front, what if doing so would actually make other people shun me or marginalize me? And I think about those who helped the Jews escape from the Nazis during World War II. I think about those who helped Black Americans escape slavery via the Underground Railroad. And oftentimes they did that at great risk to themselves. Now, we may not be called to that type of radical generosity or radical hospitality as they are, but we all can do something. And the question is, are you willing? Third thing I'll say is refugees, we should help refugees because they are our global neighbors. So I think you all know the story of the Good Samaritan. It talks about the second commandment. What is the greatest commandment? Love the Lord your God. What is the second? Love your neighbor as yourself. The religious leader asks, well, who's my neighbor? And Jesus tells this story about a Samaritan who helps this person he comes across in need. And that is who our neighbor is, someone who we run across. But because of our society today, we are globally connected to the rest of the world. Our neighbor now is not just someone, let's say like the panhandler on the side of the road we see on the way to the grocery store, although that person is our neighbor also. It's also people around the world in other countries. It includes, you have Iraqis that are still trapped after the siege in Mosul. You have Yemeni children who are dying of cholera. You have Congolese workers who are afraid of violence after the president is refusing to leave office after his term has expired. You have Venezuelan civil servants who today are forced to vote for someone supporting the president, otherwise they risk losing their job. You have Burmese Rohingya Muslims who just in the last several months have seen some of their children and infants slaughtered by Burmese security forces. So those are all examples of people who are our neighbors within our now global community. Now I will say, we do have a responsibility to help those that are close to us. I have a greater responsibility to help my children, to provide for my children, let's say children that are starving in Africa. But we are a wealthy country, so we shouldn't use that as an excuse, say, oh, we need to protect our own or provide for our own as an excuse to not help those in other parts of the world, or maybe those we don't normally help. There's no indication in that story of the Good Samaritan that he was very, very wealthy, but yet he helped someone he came across, someone who was a stranger, actually someone who was part of a group that oppressed his group, was part of the other, and yet he stopped to help that person. So to quote Jesus, we are to go and do likewise. So I ask you, and then we're going to, I'll open up for some questions, and then also talk about more specifically, what are some things that you can do as individuals and as a church to help refugees. But I will ask you, what is your gut reaction when you see these news reports about refugees and immigrants? I mean, is your reaction one of fear or disgust maybe even? Or do you have compassion or empathy for them? Would you be willing to help refugees or other marginalized peoples if there's nothing in it for you, or even if it would be risk to you, socially or economically, to help people like that? Maybe you have not thought about refugees before, or have not done anything about refugees. And so I ask you, what is something you can change to do that? That is the biblical meaning of repentance, changing your actions. You were going one way, and then you turn around and go the other way. So I ask you, is there something that you can do? So I want to open up for questions, and then I will talk about specifically some things that you all can do as individuals and as a group, maybe to help refugees. So does anyone have any questions?
I have a comment.
Yes.
I don't think it is possible to help refugees without benefit to yourself.
I agree. You will.
You learn about other faiths, you learn about other cultures, you learn to see them as us, not other. And that's true for them too.
Yeah. I can testify to that personally with working with refugees. It's really true. So thank you.
I think that the greatest human problem is dividing people into us and other. And I don't know what the solution is. You do it your entire
I'll
life.
talk about some things here in a minute, hopefully, maybe, what we can do. Any other questions? Or yes?
What is your own reasons to help immigrants and refugees?
What's my reason personally? Well, I would say some of those that I gave. I guess for me personally, I feel it's not just a job, but it's something I'm called to do. I was able to, when I was in college, I was able to go and study abroad. I grew up mostly in Iowa, small town Iowa. And I didn't really have the opportunity to interact with people from other cultures growing up. And I suspect that's true for a lot of people here in the Midwest. So I went and spent almost a year studying abroad in Peru, South America. And there's nothing like living in another culture, learning another language that will change your perspective about the world. So, especially for you, something you might think about as you get older, maybe if you're able to go to college, or just as you go through your life, consider going overseas, spending some time overseas. Some of you may not be in that stage of life where you can do that anymore, but I would ask you to encourage young people to do that. And of course, you can get to know people, refugees, and people from other cultures that are coming here as well. So, any other questions? Yes?
Do you know about how many refugees come to Iowa or Cedar Rapids area?
So last year, there were about, for 2016, there were about 1,100 that came to Iowa. Most of them are going to Des Moines. Here in Cedar Rapids, we had about 80 here. So I work with the Catholic Charities that I work for is under the Archdiocese of Dubuque. So that covers basically all of northeast Iowa. And so we don't just resettle refugees in Cedar Rapids, also in Waterloo especially. Most of them go to Cedar Rapids, say like 4/5 or so. But then we had some go to Waterloo, a few go to like Marshalltown or Postville, but most of them are coming here to Cedar Rapids.
Is that because of job availability or resources?
So part of that is because just we are a smaller agency, so our resources are limited. So we've chosen this is where we're going to concentrate our resources. Also, that's because we only resettle refugees that have what we call a U.S. tie here. So that means they have a family member or a friend who's already living here. And so typically where those are going to be are either in Waterloo or Cedar Rapids. And it's a lot less likely when you have a lot of small towns that you're going to have refugees that are already living there. Yes.
How do you counteract the attitude of, well, they chose to come here, they should assimilate and live by our culture and not by theirs?
Well, I would say, the United States has a long history of taking in people from other cultures and does a very good job in assimilating people. There's a lot less of an issue of that here than there is in, say, some European countries. And I think part of that is because we are a nation of immigrants. So there's a long history, although someone said we're a nation of immigrants that doesn't like newer immigrants. So that there's those two things. On the one hand, we're a nation of immigrants, but there's a long and deep strain of xenophobia going way back in our history also. So there is that, and it's not just a recent thing. Maybe some current events have maybe brought that more to the fore, but I think it's always been there. So in terms of what we can do to counteract that, I'll talk about that here, but I would say, first of all, get to know people from other cultures and encourage people to get to know people from other cultures. So if there are people that I don't know how many of you are on social media. If you are, you know that people can say very, very mean things on social media. I would say most of the time it's not worth talking. It's not worth responding to those people that make those comments, especially if it's not someone you know. Now, if there's someone you know, say a friend or a family member, especially that you already have a relationship with them, who, let's say you see makes a comment online or you hear them say something, say don't call them out online. It's better to talk to them in person and say, hey, did you know this about refugees? I'm learning all these things about refugees. Did you know this? Or, can I introduce you to a refugee? Because I would say most of the time people who make those comments, they don't know refugees. And so it's really hard to vilify, to demonize someone that you're in a relationship with, that's someone that you know. And the fact of the matter is a lot of people just don't know those people because they've never had the opportunity. So that's what I hope to do, is introduce people to refugees, something you could do as well. Yes, Judy.
Do you think, along those lines, do you think there's any point in trying to counteract media representations that are honestly designed to scare the holy heck out of us?
Yes, I think there is a place for that, because I think there is a time to stand up and say this is wrong. And I do see there is a need to do that. I will say for people whose minds are already made up, it's not necessarily going to change their minds. I think what most likely will change their minds if they are able to meet people from other cultures and interact with them. Of course, that's not a guarantee, but I think it will go a long way towards counteracting that. But I think there is a place, for people who maybe feel that as their calling to write letters to the editor, to suggest stories to the news media to try to counteract that. But it is true that the media has, it does have a big impact on how we view the world. Yes, Robin.
Caleb, what is the future of your work and the work of others who are similarly involved over the next, say, 3 or 4 years?
Just an arbitrary range.
Yes, well, the shorter answer is we don't know. It's been an adventure the last 6 months especially. It's a lot of back and forth, especially with, of course, there's the travel ban, which also affects refugees. There's a lot of court litigation going on back and forth with that. As it stands right now, so that went to the Supreme Court. Some of you may have heard about that. So the decision that was made by the Supreme Court is that someone coming from those 6 countries that the travel ban was enacted on, and also refugees, are allowed to come into the country if they have a bona fide relationship with someone here in the United States, person or entity. Now, of course, how is that defined? There's still some back and forth going on about what that means, and what qualifies as a bona fide relationship. At this point, one of the court rulings is that, so it's basically immediate family, including mothers, fathers, grandparents, cousins, etc. So if you have a close family relationship of that kind, then you would still be able to come into the country even while there's this basically 4-month ban on refugees coming in is what the order put in place. And the Supreme Court is supposed to take, to actually examine that, have a hearing about that in October. At that point, will it even be moot, is one of the things they were asking about. So at this point, we don't know. Like when they came down and said, so for example, we were told initially that between beginning of the summer and say the end of September, that's when the end of the fiscal year is for our national office, that we'd get maybe about up to 50 refugees coming in. And then when the ruling came down, and they interpreted it very narrowly, it said, well, grandparents don't count as close family relation, or don't count as a bona fide relationship. We were told we may only have like 6. Now, that may be expanded because of, a little bit because of expanding who counts as a bona fide relationship, but we don't know yet. So, a lot of it is up in the air right now. We don't know if we're going to get a lot, but there are refugees that are already here. There are organizations here in town that are here locally that are working with refugees that are already here. So even if we don't get many refugees coming in, there's still things that you can do individually and as a church to help refugees. To that point, I will say, so we do have Catholic Charities, we do have a program called Family Strengthening Families, where we're working with especially local churches that are interested in maybe coming in and with a new refugee family that arrives, coming in and sponsoring them for 6 months. That would be the commitment we would ask of the churches that are interested in doing that. Just to give you a quick overview of what I do with the refugees. So we receive word that they are coming. We have to get everything ready for them, get an apartment, somewhere for them to stay, furnish an apartment. We receive them at the airport. We make sure they have all their basic needs met. We help them apply for their documents, get them enrolled in English classes. If they have children, enroll their children in school. They have a lot of medical appointments that we take them to. I provide various orientations to them, like cultural orientation. And so there's a variety of things. I'm mostly working with them for the first 3 months that they are here in the United States. That is the set period of time that the government said there are these certain core services that have to be completed within that period of time. So, does anyone else have any questions? Yes, Robert.
Could you say a little bit more about what would be involved in a congregation sponsoring a refugee over, 6 months? Is that what you said?
Yes, so that's the commitment we would ask. And so a lot of it would be, so there'd be some work up front. So if this is something your congregation was interested in doing, you would discuss that with us, and we basically say, okay, we may not have someone right now, but when we have a family coming in, we'll let you know. Usually we get advance notice, hopefully at least 3 or 4 weeks before they come, so we can start preparing. If there are volunteers, we can get them involved with that. So it could be anything from, helping furnish an apartment, providing some donations, going in and moving the furniture or cleaning the apartment to get it ready. after they arrive, there's things that you could do. We would ask that maybe someone from the congregation is meeting with the family for maybe at least an hour a week. It wouldn't have to be the same person, but we would ask there to be some constant contact. And there's a variety of things that you could help them with. Anything from taking them different places if they have appointments. Could involve helping the kids, helping them with their homework, helping them with English. That's always a big need. Showing them around, maybe taking them to various events here in town, and mostly just being a friend. Imagine coming to a new culture. You speak very little of the language, or maybe not, and trying to adjust to a whole new culture in a matter of months is very, very difficult. So any help that we can get from the community, from various churches, is very helpful. And we do also help them find jobs too. That's another piece of that, because we are trying to help them become self-sufficient so they can live and survive on their own here in the United States. Any other questions? Okay, well, I think that we'll call that good for now. If any of you are interested, I can give you my card if you're interested in maybe some other ways of helping out with refugees. I have some other things that you could consider, but we'll leave it at that for today. So I want to thank you very much for inviting me, having me, and if you have any questions, then please talk to me, email me, call me. I'd be happy to talk to you more about what I do and what's happening with refugees here locally.
Can we keep the timeline?
Yes, you may.
Okay.
Actually, this, just so you know, this comes from the White House website.
Good Lord.
Although it was actually taken down when the new administration came in. Surprise, surprise.
Well, good thing you kept a handle on it.
Actually, it's
we have
still
archives there are
it's still
archives of
archived
everything online.
Well, that's cool.
So, yeah.
And I would love to have your card so that we can add it into a lot of the resources that we have for the social justice team, and maybe we can contact you about further activities. That would be great. Thank you very much for staying, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
You want to say something about next week, Stephanie?
Oh yeah, before you guys leave, we do have somebody next week. Mohammed is going to come speak about his immigration journey, and he is very entertaining, so don't miss it. He'll be here 11:15 next Sunday.